Today we're here and I'm going to be cleaning up these leaf springs. Some people might look at this and say, boy, what a waste of time. Other people might say, oh, I like the way he's really cleaning everything up so it looks like it's brand new. Looking at something rusty, isn't cool. Plus, if you get rid of rust and we get plastic in between here and you got your I don't even like leaf springs. That's why I like Chevelles instead of Camaros. They always had a better ride with coilover shocks, or with the coils and the regular shocks. They just seem to ride better. And leaf springs are real heavy. And if we clean them up, probably have less squeaking going on, and then we can paint them and they're going to look like they're brand new. So this car is a 1968, and they didn't have all the stuff like you guys got now in Hot Rod Magazine. You can just buy something from Street Works or Speed Demon or whatever. You went to the local dealer down the road that was, we had Babcock Springs or some alignment shop, and they just get special steel. It's spring steel. And they probably get it off of a truck, load it up on a rack, and then when somebody says, oh, I don't like my 69 Nova sagging in the back end, I want it jacked up a little. And the guy would say, how much do you want to lift it up? He goes, oh, I want it about 4 inches higher. I've seen some guys that went to go get new springs, and all of a sudden the car looked like it was a 4x4 in the back or a snowplow going down the road. But you'll see the quality of their workmanship too. Sometimes they just cut it with a cutting torch. They don't clean up the ends. I mean, this one's really bad. There was like, I ground it already. But I mean, we're talking, you could see why the plastic got chewed up in between, because instead of it riding from one leaf spring to the other, and this is how these things work, there's friction between these springs, and the more you stack, these have built-in spring into them, but there is friction between them, and that's what resists movement. And they make noise when they're scuffing past each other. This is like a trick that the Mopar guys used to use on the passenger side leaf spring. They call them super stock springs. They'd have more springs stacked up in the front where the rear end's trying to climb, and the leaf springs would actually bend, and they'd beef up the front section. So this guy must have added like a half a leaf. The shorter ones make your ride stiffer. If you just had one long spring, then it's going to be more compliant. You see a Corvette now, and they got a fiberglass spring that goes all the way across the opposite direction of the car, and that's a really nice setup. But technology has really improved a lot. Back in the day, I mean, you just thought when they wanted something to be for a heavy load like on a truck, the shorter springs that they make really increase the stiffness. And with a truck, sometimes with a half-ton truck, they ride stiffer when there's no load in it than if you bought a 3/4-ton truck, and then they'd have it set up for when you ride normal with an empty box. Then they'd have these helper springs that came into play that were brackets on the frame, and then as you started loading the truck down, then these big heavy leaves would hit these brackets and then keep the car from sacking out. So they could have it like a dual purpose, empty, nice ride, loaded, go on the helper springs. I know a half-ton truck that's empty, it's just bouncy like a lumber wagon. You see all different ways these guys would work. You can see this one's like a shear. They would probably have a machine that hydraulically, that's decent, at least it's beveled on each side. This is rough as a cob, and if you don't even dress up, the edges, then it's going to cut into them plastic pieces that ride in between. This is all You know, this is all beat up now. But it's trying to stop all the squeaking noise. You can tell if your car is all right. When I had my Jeep, it rolled rough as hell. You take the shocks off, and all of a sudden, you're pushing on the bumper, and it's going boing, boing, boing. And I says, wow, are these things weak springs? It must be all in the stiff shocks that's holding this thing. And the guy goes, it's all you want is enough spring pressure to keep the body, you know, away from the tire. If you had any more, you know, like back in the old days when these guys would have these monster trucks, they'd take the parts off the military deuce and a quarters, and they'd have these, you know, 2.5 ton axles underneath them, and then they'd put the leaf spring pack that was from those trucks that was used for hauling a lot of stuff. Nothing moved. So actually their frames moved. Well, that changed really quickly, and you know, at first guys would take more of the springs out of it, and then they went to just air shocks, and they got all different types of shocks now. If you see monster trucks, they're well designed now. Even though they're 10,000 pounds still, they, you know, fly through the air and they land and it absorbs their bumps. They've gone away from this technology with the leaf spring. But don't be scared if you take your shocks off someday and your car rides like a buggy. That's all it's supposed to do, is just suspend the body. You don't want too much where you couldn't move it, because then you might as well not even, I mean, the shocks wouldn't even come into play if the springs were so tight that it didn't go up and down when you hit bumps. You probably wonder, how do they make leaf springs? Are they made in that shape? No. When the stock comes into a shop, you know, like an alignment shop that does suspension, it just comes in, it's a certain type of steel, it's spring steel, and it's just flat. And when they want to give you the certain amount of lift to get your car at the right attitude, then they just put this thing between two blocks, and they use a press, and they just bend it. And these guys have been doing it for so long that they know about how much they got to do just with the feel of the press, and they can arc these springs just by, you know, putting a piece between here and here, and then they press down in the middle with a flat piece in there, and then when they press it, it just goes. It doesn't go through a roller or anything. So let's say you're having a set of custom leaf springs made. After you see it done, you're just thinking like, man, there's no magic in this. The guy just takes a torch and he heats this metal up, and they start bending this thing around and rolling it. They might have a pin this size, and they just beat it around. And this would be for a regular suspension, okay? Now, let's say if you had a 32 Roadster and you wanted to drop the suspension down, they'd call it a reversed eye. They'd just take the same material. You need the same distance so that you meet up with the shackles. The shackles are what allows the, you know, the spring grows. Right now there's a distance of here to here, and then when you hit a bump and it bends out, it's not, if you didn't have anything move, it wouldn't budge. So you got to have shackles that'll let this leaf spring expand out, and by taking the leaf spring and rolling it the other way around, you can see the difference that you would go from over here, then all of a sudden rolling it the other way, you're dropping down 4 inches already. And that was a trick that they used back in the old, you know, hot rod days, and they still do it. You'll just, when you're reading a description on leaf spring, if it says reversed eye, it means it's going backward. So we were talking about these leaf springs and how guys would modify their cars, and I talked about in the past where, you know, when the '67 Camaro came out, you got engineers that design a car. They're working with the constraints of what the Nova was in the first place, so they had an indication of what they had for suspension holding up the car originally. And these engineers are smart enough to figure out about how much spring pressure they should have, and you know what it's going to take to hold this car up. But then after that, they had test drivers that actually went out on a track And they got to make a car that's going to be acceptable to a lady going to get her groceries at the grocery store or going to work. And then you had to make it sporty enough for a guy that wants to take it out once in a while and romp on his car. Well, you're always going to have guys that put up with more hassle and make a car like less streetable, but when they drive their car, they want it to ride taut, and when they go into a corner, they don't want this flexi flyer twisting all up and the front end leaning way over and the tire buckling underneath and not cornering very well. Well, they've had engineers all the time that work for different manufacturers that go off on their own. And back in my day, there was a guy named Herb Adams, and then there was another guy named Dick Gullstrand. And they both, the reason they're going into this line of work, being an engineer for working on cars, is because they love cars. And then most of these guys were race car drivers too. They got probably parts for cheap at work. And then they wanted to improve on the car. And when the platform is just made for a regular, production vehicle, they knew how, plus they had the test drivers to tell them what it was handling like, and they'd probably take the cars out themselves and drive it, and they go, man, I want my car a lot stiffer. Well, when you live in the area where we live, or if you lived in Detroit or in the Northeast, you get a lot of frost and we have potholes and stuff, and if you have a suspension that's overly stiff, it's just going to hit these potholes and jar your fillings loose. And you had these two engineers that thought differently. One, and you know how they always say, you can, there's 100 ways to skin a cat. Well, the way that you make your car handle can be done differently too. And like I was saying, everybody on the computer has an opinion. Well, these guys had opposing opinions, and one guy wanted really stiff springs with loose shocks and big-ass sway bars. Then the other guy said, I think you should have soft springs because most of the time you're just driving down the highway and you want the thing to ride, comfortably. But put stiff shocks in it so that when you go into a curve, you can tune your shock absorbers to resist, going down. Whereas like a guy with a dragster, he wants his to come up really easy and do weight transfer. They're only going down a straight line, okay? But if you want a car that's going to be handling, the one guy would tell the other guy that having too fat of sway bars was ridiculous because pretty soon, instead of having independent suspension, you got a bump hitting this wheel, and if the sway bar is too big for the weight of that car, it's going to carry the other wheel up with it. So you want to still have independent suspension. Nowadays, that, with our modern vehicles, it took a while for Mustangs to, Cobra Mustang did have independent rear suspension, but now they all have it. The Challenger, the Camaro, and the Mustang all have independent rear suspension. If you have one wheel hitting the tire and it upsets the whole car, you're not going to go as fast around a track as if you have one wheel going up and down, the other three are still giving you traction to go around corners. That's why they like independent rear suspension. So he believed that too fat of sway bars, too stiff of springs was a bad idea. It all depends on how you like your car to feel. And some guys like having their car real taut and stiff, and other people want their car to ride nice and soft, but they don't want it to boat out on them when they go into corners. So whenever somebody makes a statement, like don't do this or don't do that, it all depends about a bunch of other things that you do to your car to control the way it behaves. When it comes to leaf springs, some guys, if they're just going for a slow lowrider thing, and if you've got your leaf spring mounted on top of a axle, you know, here you got the leaf spring coming, you got the pad underneath the, the pad is on top of the rear end. Really quick way to lower the car about 3 inches, the width of the axle tube and the pad, is to put the rear end now on top of the, that's the way this vehicle is, the rear end sits on top of the leaf springs, which is better for a car because, you know, on a truck they have the leaf springs above it, you know, for load and hauling stuff, and then they put lift blocks on them. I don't like lift blocks because that's like putting a pipe on the end of a wrench. What goes into that little block, you know, the torque of the rear end and everything is gonna upset the spring a lot different than if you get actual leaf, you know, the main leaf is arced to give you your lift, and it's best to have your axle, you know, supported on the spring, I think. But a lot of guys do it. They'll either flip the spring above or below, depending on if you want to lower it. And then when you end up putting blocks and have your rear end up above, then you got to worry. You know, a lot of times we always worry about a drive shaft coming out of the slip yoke. When you start going the other way too, it can happen where they lower the car so darn much that the car's axle is further away. Sometimes you got to lengthen the drive shaft, and the angle of the U-joints starts to be a hassle. You know, you start, you know, wearing out U-joints, and the slip yoke could pull right out of the back of the transmission. You know, as cars in the 50s started increasing with horsepower, there were ways to tune your leaf springs, you know, because there was no such thing as coil, well there was, but only on really expensive cars where they had coil-over shocks. So most people were poor and they bought their 55 Chevy or 57 Chevy, and you had leaf springs underneath it, and if you started getting that axle wrap, they would just take clamps, you know, 2 strips of steel, you drill holes and you'd clamp the front part of the leaf springs together. Then in 1967, a guy named Grumpy Jenkins, he was racing a Camaro, and to stop the axle wrap from happening, he just made a square tube with a rubber snubber on it and bolted to the, you know, it was underneath here, and the U-bolts went around to hold the rear end. And when this thing wanted, you know, the rear end wanted to climb, the rubber snubber hit it, and it kept these leaf springs from bending too much. And now you got a guy named Caltrax, you know, that makes suspension. Actually, when you buy it, you get 2 separate leaf springs, and they're in halves. And once you got the rear end, you know, mounted in your car, you end up taking the 2 leaf springs after you've got the ride height set, you clamp them together. And it's got this teeter-totter device, you know, that hits the top of the leaf spring and keeps the rear end from rotating. It kind of acts like a 4-link. So there's guys that are still running leaf springs back in the old days, and they're probably running stock, and they've got to stay with the leaf spring suspension, and they just got little 10.5 inch wide tires, and they're going 10 seconds in the quarter mile. So, and they still work, they're just heavier. In the older days, the tires weren't of proper quality. You know, they made tires that would last because everybody was hurting for money. You wanted to get as much longevity out of these tires as possible. Well, the guys that were racing knew right away that spinning isn't winning, and they needed something to get better traction. So you'd take your worn out tire down to the bandag, you know, and they'd recap your tire, but they'd carve the carcass off just kind of like a lathe, and they'd turn all the rubber off, and they'd vulcanize, they call them like a cheater slick, and then it was butyl rubber, and it was softer. So once they had more tire underneath the car, nobody made custom wheels, you'd have to cut your steel rim, widen it, you know, some cars had big giant wheel tubs. If they didn't, you know, like on a 55, 57 Chevy where you had a boxed frame, you'd actually cut a hole in the frame and mount the axles right underneath the frame. Most of the time they had brackets that came out on the side of the frame, and then your tire would be hitting the leaf springs. But if you move the leaf springs underneath the frame, you could put tires all the way to the frame and they'd tub it out. Then they started getting more and more traction with fatter tires, and then, you know, suspension modifications kept improving, and we've got speed shop places now that sell, you know, all kinds of stuff to do to your car. You just go to Jegs or Summit and order the stuff. But back in the old days, these guys had to have ingenuity and figure out how to make their car go faster, because you were lucky if you had a hardware store down the road, yet alone a speed shop. If you went to a speed shop, it was some farmer that had equipment to work on their tractors, and then when the crops are planted and there's nothing else to do, they'd have a boring bar, they'd have a lathe and some honing, ball honer, and people would take their cars to them because they thought they were smarter. And you drive up on the place and you'd see this old claw foot bathtub on cinder blocks with a hibachi grill going on underneath it, and a cherry picker, where they'd hot tank the blocks, and it was pretty rustic back in the early days. And then they'd get out their magazines, and they had connections where they could order parts from Vic Edelbrock or a Chet Herbert cam or Iskey cam, and now you can just buy the stuff right from Jegs and Summit, and it's quick. And you used to have to wait for parts, and then a lot of times these guys, acted like they were a big guru working on engines, and the things would blow up right away, and they didn't have the money to back it up or anything. So a lot of people had to learn how to start fixing this stuff on their own. And you read magazines, and you see what the pros are doing, and you copied them.